The richest man in the city had just done the unthinkable. In front of hundreds of wealthy guests, he called an elderly woman a beggar and ordered security to throw her out. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. As she quietly turned to leave, a small paper bag slipped from her hands. An old photograph fell onto the marble floor. The billionaire picked it up, and in an instant, the color drained from his face. His hands began to shake, because the frightened teenage boy in that photograph was him, and the elderly woman he had just humiliated was the one who had saved his life 25 years ago. What happened next left everyone speechless. Welcome to Heartnest Stories, where every story reminds us that one small act of kindness can change someone's life forever. If you enjoy emotional stories filled with hope, compassion, and unforgettable life lessons, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Heartnest Stories, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next inspiring journey. Now, let's begin today's unforgettable story. The elderly woman took a slow, deep breath and looked down at the paper bag one more time. Inside lay the blue wool scarf she had knitted by hand. Her fingers still carried tiny scars from years of sewing clothes to earn a living. She smiled gently. "I hope he still remembers kindness," she whispered. She had no appointment, no invitation, no expectation. She only wanted to hand Richard the scarf, quietly thank him, and leave before anyone noticed. As she slowly climbed the marble staircase leading to the hotel's grand entrance, two security guards stepped in front of her. "Good evening, ma'am," one of them said politely. "This event is private. Only invited guests may enter." Margaret nodded respectfully. "I understand." She held up the paper bag with both hands. "I only need 1 minute. I have a small gift for Mr. Richard Harrison." The second guard glanced at her faded coat and worn shoes before looking at the growing line of luxury guests behind her. "I'm sorry," he replied. "Mr. Harrison is very busy tonight." Margaret smiled kindly. "I've waited 25 years. I can wait 1 more minute." Before either guard could answer, the sound of dozens of camera shutters suddenly filled the entrance. A long black Rolls-Royce stopped in front of the red carpet. Photographers rushed forward. "There he is. Richard. Over here. 1 picture, sir." The rear door opened. Richard Harrison stepped out wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. He smiled confidently, waving at reporters while adjusting his jacket. Business leaders hurried to greet him. Television crews surrounded him. Every eye was fixed on the billionaire. Every eye, except one. Margaret simply watched him with quiet pride. She wasn't impressed by his wealth. She remembered the frightened young man he used to be. She took a careful step forward. "Mr. Harrison." Her voice disappeared beneath the cameras. She tried again. "Richard." This time he turned. For just a second, their eyes met. Margaret's face lit up with hope. She gently raised the paper bag. "I brought something for you." Richard frowned slightly. He looked at her faded clothes, then at the old shoes on her feet, then at the paper bag. The smile slowly disappeared from his face. Photographers immediately noticed the unusual moment. Their cameras turned toward the old woman. Richard glanced around at the important guests watching him. His expression became tense. "Who is she?" he asked coldly. One security guard answered quickly. "She says she has a gift for you, sir." Richard's face hardened. "I don't know her." The words hit Margaret harder than the winter wind. She lowered the paper bag slightly. "I don't expect you to remember me," she said softly. "I only wanted to thank you." Richard looked at the cameras. He didn't want this awkward moment becoming tomorrow's headline. His voice grew louder. "Please remove her." The security guard stepped closer. Margaret quickly shook her head. "No, please. It will only take a moment. I came a long way." Richard sighed impatiently. Then, in front of hundreds of guests and dozens of cameras, he said the words that would haunt him forever. "I don't accept gifts from beggars." Silence. Every conversation stopped. Even the photographers lowered their cameras for a second. Margaret's smile slowly disappeared. Her eyes filled with quiet sadness. "I'm not a beggar." Her voice was barely a whisper, but no one seemed to hear it. One of the security guards gently placed a hand on Margaret's arm. "Please come with me, ma'am." Margaret didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply nodded. For a brief moment, she looked at Richard one last time. Not with anger, not with disappointment, but with the quiet sadness of someone who had expected nothing, yet still hoped for something. She slowly turned away. As she took her first step down the marble stairs, the brown paper bag slipped from her hands. It hit the ground. The blue hand-knitted scarf unfolded across the polished marble floor. A small cream-colored envelope slid out from beneath it and stopped beside Richard's polished shoes. Richard frowned. Almost without thinking, he bent down and picked it up. "There must be another request for money," one guest whispered. Another man shrugged. "Probably." Richard slowly opened the envelope. There was no letter asking for help. No bank details. No donation request. Only an old black and white photograph. The edges of the picture were worn with age. For a second, Richard looked confused. Then, his breathing stopped. The photograph showed a skinny teenage boy wearing torn clothes, standing beside a kind-looking middle-aged woman with a warm smile. The boy looked frightened, cold, hungry, but the woman beside him had one hand resting gently on his shoulder. Richard's fingers began to tremble. His eyes widened. "No," he whispered. "It can't be." He turned the photograph over. On the back, written in faded blue ink, were words he hadn't seen in 25 years. "Never stop believing in yourself. Margaret." The world around him disappeared. The flashing cameras, the reporters, the laughter, the music inside the ballroom. Everything faded into silence. A forgotten memory came rushing back like a storm. 25 years earlier, Richard had not been rich. He had not been successful. He had not even believed he had a future. After losing both of his parents in a tragic accident, he had spent weeks sleeping wherever he could: park benches, train stations, abandoned buildings. Some days he found work. Most days he found nothing. For 2 days straight, he had eaten almost nothing. One freezing evening, too weak to keep walking, he collapsed onto a snow-covered park bench. He believed that night might be his last. Then, a gentle voice broke the silence. "Young man, are you hungry?" Richard slowly opened his eyes. Standing before him was a woman wearing a simple gray coat. She held a paper bag in one hand and a warm bowl of homemade soup in the other. It was Margaret. Margaret smiled gently as she knelt beside the frightened teenager. "You don't have to be afraid," she said softly. Richard tried to sit up, but he was too weak. I don't have any money," he whispered. Margaret's warm smile never faded. "I didn't ask for any." She handed him the steaming bowl of homemade vegetable soup along with 2 slices of fresh bread. Richard hesitated. It had been 2 days since he had eaten a proper meal. The smell alone brought tears to his eyes. "Go ahead," Margaret said kindly. "It's still hot." With trembling hands, Richard accepted the bowl. The first spoonful filled his body with warmth. By the second bite, tears were running down his face. No one had shown him such kindness since his parents had passed away. Margaret sat quietly beside him, saying nothing. She understood that sometimes a person doesn't need advice. They simply need someone who cares. After Richard finished eating, Margaret reached into her old handbag and pulled out a small notebook. The cover was worn. The pages were yellow with age. She placed it in his hands. "When life tells you to give up," she said, "open this." Richard looked at the first page. Written in beautiful blue handwriting were the words, "Your circumstances do not decide your future. Your choices do." He read the sentence again and again, for the first time in months. He felt hope. Margaret stood up. Richard quickly looked at her. "Wait, what is your name?" She smiled. "Margaret. And yours?" "Richard." She nodded warmly. "One day, Richard, you'll have the chance to help someone else. Promise me you'll never forget what kindness feels like." Richard looked into her eyes and answered without hesitation, "I promise." Margaret smiled one last time before quietly walking away into the falling snow. Richard watched until she disappeared from sight. He didn't know it then, but that single evening would change the course of his entire life. The notebook became his greatest treasure. Whenever he failed, he opened it. Whenever people laughed at his dreams, he opened it. Whenever he wanted to quit, he opened it again. Years passed. Richard worked every job he could find. He studied at night, saved every dollar, started a tiny repair business in a rented garage. His first business failed, then his second, but he never forgot Margaret's words. He kept moving forward. Slowly, success arrived. One company became 2. 2 became 5. Within 20 years, Richard Harrison had become one of the wealthiest businessmen in the country. Newspapers called him a genius. Television celebrated his success. But somewhere along the way, as the companies grew, as the meetings became endless, as the fame surrounded him, the notebook was packed into an old storage box. The photograph disappeared among forgotten memories. And Margaret, the woman who had once saved his life, slowly disappeared from his mind. Until tonight. Richard's hands shook violently as he stared at the old photograph. His breathing became heavy. His eyes filled with tears. Oh my God, what have I done? Without thinking for another second, Richard dropped the photograph and ran. Margaret. His voice echoed across the hotel entrance. Every conversation stopped. The photographers immediately turned their cameras toward him. The security guards stepped aside in confusion. Margaret had already reached the bottom of the marble staircase. She paused. Slowly, she turned around. For a moment, their eyes met again. This time, Richard wasn't looking at an old woman in worn-out clothes. He was looking at the person who had once given him a reason to live. His breathing was heavy as he hurried toward her. When he finally reached her, he couldn't find the words. His lips trembled. His eyes filled with tears. Then, to everyone's complete shock, Richard Harrison, the richest man in the city, slowly fell to his knees. The crowd gasped. Camera flashes exploded from every direction. No one could believe what they were seeing. Richard lowered his head. I'm sorry. His voice cracked. I'm so sorry. Margaret looked at him quietly. There was no anger in her eyes. No bitterness. Only kindness. Richard held out the old photograph with shaking hands. I remembered everything. His tears fell onto the photograph. You fed me when I was starving. You believed in me when nobody else did. You gave me hope. And tonight, I called you a beggar. His shoulders shook as he cried openly. I don't deserve your forgiveness. For several seconds, Margaret said nothing. She simply looked at the frightened little boy she had once met beneath all the wealth, fame, and success. Then she stepped closer. Very gently, she placed her hand on Richard's shoulder. Look at me. Richard slowly raised his head. Margaret smiled. The boy I helped 25 years ago is still inside you. Richard closed his eyes. More tears rolled down his face. I failed you. Margaret slowly shook her head. No, you only forgot. And sometimes, life brings people back together, so they can remember. Richard couldn't stop crying. Around them, many guests wiped tears from their own eyes. One photographer quietly lowered his camera. A waitress standing near the entrance covered her mouth as tears ran down her cheeks. Even the security guards looked away in shame. Richard carefully picked up the blue hand-knitted scarf from the marble floor. He held it against his chest. I've received expensive gifts from kings, from presidents, from billionaires, but nothing will ever be more valuable than this. Margaret smiled softly. I never came here to embarrass you. I only wanted to say thank you. Richard looked confused. Thank me. Margaret nodded. I heard what you've done for thousands of people. I wanted to know if the kindness you once received had continued through someone else. Richard stared at her. For the first time that night, he truly understood something. Success had made him famous, but kindness had made him human. He stood up slowly, still holding Margaret's scarf close to his heart. Then he turned toward the ballroom filled with hundreds of wealthy guests. I have something I need to say. And without waiting for anyone's permission, Richard walked back inside. This time, not as the city's richest man, but as the grateful young boy whose life had once been saved by a stranger. The ballroom fell completely silent as Richard walked toward the stage. Every guest watched him. The speech that had been carefully prepared by his assistants still lay on the podium. Richard looked at the papers for a moment, then quietly pushed them aside. He wasn't going to read someone else's words. Tonight, he would speak from his heart. He stepped up to the microphone. His voice was calm, but everyone could hear the emotion behind it. Tonight, I was supposed to give a speech about success. He paused. But I've just realized, I don't deserve to speak about success. The audience exchanged confused glances. Richard lifted the blue hand-knitted scarf for everyone to see. This scarf was made by the woman who saved my life 25 years ago. He pointed gently toward Margaret, who stood quietly near the entrance, still wearing the same faded gray coat. Many years ago, I was a hungry teenager with no family, no money, and no hope. She gave me food. She gave me warmth. But more importantly, she gave me a reason to believe in myself. The ballroom was silent. Some guests lowered their heads. Others wiped tears from their eyes. Richard took a deep breath. And tonight, I repaid her kindness with the greatest mistake of my life. He looked directly at the audience. I judged someone by their clothes. I cared more about my image than about a human being. If that can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. He walked down from the stage and held out his hand to Margaret. Would you please stand beside me? Margaret smiled gently. I don't belong on a stage. Richard smiled through his tears. You've belonged here long before I ever did. The audience rose to their feet as Margaret slowly walked onto the stage beside him. The applause echoed through the ballroom. It continued and continued until many people were crying openly. When the applause finally faded, Richard made one final announcement. Starting tomorrow, my company will establish a new foundation. It will provide food, education, shelter, and hope for homeless teenagers and lonely elderly people. He paused. And it will not carry my name. It will be called the Margaret Foundation. The audience erupted into applause once again. Margaret looked at Richard with tears in her eyes. You don't owe me this, she whispered. Richard gently smiled. I know. I'm simply keeping a promise I made 25 years ago. Months later, the first Margaret Foundation Center opened its doors. Hundreds of homeless teenagers found safe shelter. Lonely elderly people found friendship and dignity. Families received help without being judged. And above the entrance of every center, visitors read the same words engraved in stone. Never judge a person's worth by their appearance. The greatest gift you can give another person is kindness. Years later, a journalist asked Richard Harrison a simple question. What was the greatest investment of your life? Richard smiled. It wasn't a company. It wasn't a building. It wasn't a business deal. It was one bowl of warm soup, shared by a woman who had almost nothing. And that single act of kindness created everything I have today. Because in the end, people may forget your success. They may forget your wealth. But they will never forget how you made them feel.